Hello, everybody. It's a tremendous joy for me to have my great friend and someone whom I love and admire deeply, Paul Levy, with me. We're going to be talking about the stage of the very extraordinary, extreme, and unprecedented evolutionary crisis we are in. And it's one of the things I admire most about Paul is his great clarity, the clarity with which he has addressed the themes of darkness and what he calls Wetiko in this vast evolutionary event, and also the clarity with which he follows the crisis. About 2 weeks ago, perhaps it was a little bit longer than then, uh, Paul sent me an amazing page, a download that he'd had. And in this download, he describes exactly where he believes we are. And I must say, I deeply agree with him. And he compares the stage that we are at to the stage that a caterpillar reaches in the cocoon when nearly all of its body has been completely dissolved within the cocoon. And there is this boiling, strange, seething, weird mixture forming in which imaginal cells are born that later construct the body of the butterfly that will break the cocoon. But the brilliance of Paul's analysis is that he locates us at the very moment when that disillusion is nearly complete and speaks about that moment as the most dangerous because the most precarious and the most volatile of the entire transformation. So, Paul, I'd love you to describe your download and what this image means to you now and what it means to you in terms of the world we're negotiating at this moment.
For sure.
Thank you so much.
No, I appreciate that, Andrew. So yeah, both individually and collectively as a species, where, the idea of how a caterpillar, it turns into this biotic goo, it first, it cocoons itself and then turns into this, this goo. And think about that just individually, so many of us feel like, oh my God, like who am I? Or the rug is being pulled out from under us, or what's the meaning of this? What's happening in our world? And that's this dangerous moment, because for an individual to go through that could be the time where somebody, they jump off bridges and commit suicide. And it's a known thing psychologically that when we commit suicide, and we're actually enacting collective suicide, interestingly enough, that it's a known thing that so often, if not always, that's right at the point before a breakthrough is about to happen. And the ego, which is still clinging on and grasping and identified with our old sense of identity, feels threatened. So in this biotic goo, there are these things that Andrew mentioned called the imaginal cells that start to activate. Now, the thing which is interesting is that from the point of view of the goo, the imaginal cells are seen as a threat. And so it
Yes.
creates this incredible conflict and this resistance, and they fight against the imaginal cells, which, from the evolutionary point of view, makes the imaginal cells even stronger and helps them to replicate and propagate. And that process just continues. And then the imaginal cells begin to take over the evolution of this creature that then alchemically transforms into a butterfly. And I was pointing out that, oh, that maps on to the process that our species is going through, both individually and collectively. And that, I think, it's funny that I got, so when I shared this download that I got, I've never gotten so many positive reflections. It really speaks to people. And if I could just say one more thing, like if you think about it, the caterpillars, so say if the one caterpillar turns into a butterfly and it flies away, and then it comes back and hangs out with its caterpillar friends, the caterpillar, or at least I imagine, the caterpillar friends who are hanging out with the butterfly more quickly begin to sprout wings, because their unconscious is recognizing in the image of the butterfly their,
Wow,
fully
their
formed,
destiny.
it's their destiny, and that's why it's so helpful to hang out with people who are really sort of, have individuated and are in touch with their wholeness and are in touch with their nature, because similar to a caterpillar recognizing their own latent internal image of their nature in the butterfly, when we hang out with people who are embodying the self, like who we are, we begin to sprout wings and we begin to more deepen our connection to our true nature.
Love it, because you've laid out the whole scope of our conversation. And I'd like to start with the beginning, if it's okay.
Yeah, yeah.
When the caterpillar cocoons itself, it starts to dissolve. And I feel that we are towards the end of a massive period of radical dissolution of all of the accepted structures in all of the realms of the world, including the spiritual, moral, and mystical.
Yeah, yeah.
And that this radical dissolution of all the structures, which we can see it in what's happening in Gaza, we can see it in what's happening in the triumph of misinformation and the triumph of a fascist rhetoric potentially in our own country. This dissolution not only affects the outside of things, it affects in deep ways, as you said, our notion of our own identity, and even more painfully, our very vision of possibility, of creativity, of whether we can make any kind of difference in a situation as mad, murky, dark as the one we find ourselves in.
Right.
And I would like to concentrate on that particular stage because I think it's the stage which millions of people are now beginning to reach, a stage of total bewilderment, deep funk, temptation to paralysis, sense that the human race is mad and that there's nothing that can stop this madness, and born with those, a desire either to sign off from the human experiment and
Right.
sex, drugs, rock and roll, or to do some of the mad magical thinking that some of our spiritual teachers are doing, or to simply, in an act of what I call suicidal mysticism, just accept that the whole thing is going to go and somehow make your peace with it.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
those are the reactions that are arising at this moment, and they are as dangerous as the situation itself.
Yeah.
Because what's most needed at the stage that we find ourselves is what you alluded to in your beautiful summary. What's most needed is a sense that this process, agonizing, terrible though it is, has a meaning and a goal
Yeah.
and an inner necessity which obeys a vast evolutionary will of the divine.
Yeah.
And if at this moment we allow the facts of this unprecedented dissolution of all structures to swerve us from that knowledge of our destined butterflyhood, then everything is lost.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a dangerous time. And part of, the propaganda, so to speak, is that we're helpless and it's hopeless, and as soon as we subscribe to that, then we're part of the problem. And yeah, from one point of view, yeah, we're only one person out of 8 billion. What can we do? But on the other hand, what the discoveries of science, of quantum physics, are pointing out that we have enormous, unimaginable power, each one of us, to create our experience. And to the extent that we're able to tap into our nature, so in other words, to see the darkness, because if we turn away from the darkness, I point out in my work, we're unwittingly feeding it. But if we see it, and if we become overwhelmed and filled with despair, then we're no use. We can't be of benefit. But there's a sense of cultivating our connection with the self, with our nature. And that enables us to really have eyes to see the darkness and to see in the darkness and to see the light that's revealing itself through the darkness. And to the extent we're in touch with ourselves, you see, I just want to go one step back for a moment. Like, it's such a cliche. Oh, to connect with our true nature, to connect with yourself. What does that mean? And I point out, well, our nature, by its very nature, is creative. So when we connect with our nature, we just, in a very natural way, embody being creative, and we express ourselves creatively. And the more we do that, the deepen the realization of our nature in a positive feedback loop that creates light upon light. And any one of us doing that non-locally, instantaneously, just emanates throughout the entire universe and makes that light more available for other people to do. And the more that I study the work, like, because my main person that I study is the work of Jung, the great psychiatrist, you know, and it's been 40 plus years I've been studying him. And just in the last year, I'm even getting a deeper appreciation. This is one of his major ideas, that any one of us having realization of our nature, adding light to our shadows, seeing Wetiko, there are a lot of ways of saying it. Any one of us doing that, to quote him, could be the make weight that tips the scales. And that's
It's
enormously inspiring.
not to dampen that, but to just go deeper into it. I think one of the reasons that makes this analysis of yours of the place where we've reached in our crisis so compelling and so accurate is that we are facing an unprecedented evolutionary crisis, which demands great psychological acumen and spiritual intensity at the very moment when we're so denuded of both.
Right.
At the very moment in which there's hardly any profound psychological discourse in the public sphere, and at the very moment when the sacred has been banished from almost every realm of our world.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
here we are at the most dramatic moment of our entire human journey, terrifyingly disarmed, terrifyingly depleted, terrifyingly at a loss with any of our available schemas to deal with the situation we have to deal with.
Right, right. And what you just said, what it brings up in me, you're familiar with my work on there's this mind
Yes.
virus, the Wetiko mind virus, and people hear about a mind virus and, it sounds sort of new agey or, whatever. But in essence, what it's really saying is that the origin, the source, and the solution of our current crisis is to be found within the psyche. That what's playing out in our world, the collective madness and the evil that's playing out in our world, the source of that is to be found inside of our psyche. And that's a no-brainer. Where else in the world could it be
Would it
found?
be?
Yeah,
Yes.
and so the point is that what's playing out in the world, whether it's in Ukraine or Gaza or just whatever, there are endless horrors. The origin of all of that, we're having a collective dream. And this is reflecting something very shadowy in ourselves. And to the extent that any one of us, and this is Jung, he talks about that the way to change the world is through the individual. It's not through making new laws, or yeah, that could be helpful, but it has to start with the individual. And the individual is not separate from, is a part of the whole. And when any one person actually deepens their awakening and sees the darkness, both in the world and in themselves, and see, oh, wow, the origin of this is actually found in our unconscious. It's exactly like if somebody had a dream and the dream was what's happening in our world right now. And they came to me and they shared the dream and they asked me, well, how do I interpret that dream? And I would say, wow, well, that's what's playing out in your dream is clearly expressing something going on
Something.
inside of you. And if I would even take it the next step, I would say you're having a dream like that because you're not connected with your creative power. So you've outsourced your creative agency, and external powers that be, whoever that is, the state or whoever, are more than happy to assume your own creative power and turn it against you. And so the solution, what the dream is showing that person, and that is our dream, is the profound importance of any one of us connecting with our creative agency, because that's our nature, is to be creative. But part of the spell is that, oh, so many people I work with, oh, I'm stuck creatively. I have resistance. I feel blocked. I'm not creative and all that. And that's the spell. It's like our species has fallen under a spell.
I love what you say, but I wonder if you agree with me when I say this. What I often try and encourage people by saying is this: if you look at the horror of our current predicament, it does involve a great deal of creativity. It takes a lot of creativity to create so much disaster in every realm. The
Right,
problem is that that creativity is not connected to the deep laws of the psyche, nor
right.
to the deep laws of the sacred, nor to the fundamental revelations of mystical truth.
Yeah,
So instead of saying about humanity that it is doomed because it's dark and its creativity is satanic or demonic or whatever word you want to
right.
use, why not reframe the situation and say, if we're capable of such massive destruction, doesn't that show how profoundly powerful our creativity is? And doesn't that show that if we could transform the source of that creativity and relink that creativity to much larger, more expansive, more holistic, more compassionate visions, then we would find a way out of the very situation we have created?
Yeah, no, that's I 100% am with you, Andrew. That's beautiful. One way I think of that, when I'll meet people who say, "Oh, I'm not creative," and I point out to them, "Oh my God, you're so creative, but you're using your creativity to create the experience that's very convincing that you're not creative. That's how creative you are." And that, in essence, is what we're doing as a species. We're all, by our nature, we're tapped into the creative source of the universe each and every moment. We are that source. We're the channel for that. And but to the extent we've been conditioned or programmed, oh, I'm limited, I'm traumatized, I'm wounded, I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, whatever, just whatever the story is, by the power of our creativity, we will attract evidence from the dreamlike universe to confirm our point of view in a self-reinforcing feedback loop in which we entrance ourselves. That's what I told, like when I'll say our species is under a spell, that's what I mean. And that just self-reinforces. And then when we hang out with other people who are also entrancing themselves under that same spell, there's like a collective, there's a psychic epidemic, and that's what's happened. That's what's happening in our world right now.
I hear you. And I was wondering, though, something that is, I think about a great deal, and that is this. You're saying, and you're saying it so convincingly, and I believe it, is that one of the ways in which we thrive in a situation as awful as the one we found ourselves in is to tap into our deepest sources of creativity.
Right.
However, one of the characteristics of the Dark Knight process, and there's a direct link between the whole process of the creation of a butterfly out of a caterpillar to the Dark Knight process, because
Yeah,
in the Dark
totally.
Knight process, you do dissolve, and slowly, miraculously, a new identity constitutes itself through revelation and prayer and working with the mystery. That is
Right.
the Dark Knight process.
Right.
One of the things I've learned about the Dark Knight process is that the only creativity that can deal with the situation that creates the Dark Knight is the creativity that's born out of going through the Dark Knight.
Yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah.
one of the Dark Knight's characteristics is that it makes impossible the kinds of creative actions that you took in your previous consciousness.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, totally. And I so relate
But you
just
see
to my own.
that's the difficulty. There is the
Yeah,
difficulty because how many people are prepared to really let this situation of dissolution strip them deeply enough to become a new kind of human being?
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
how many people even know that that is possible or have the tools for
Yeah, yeah,
that?
yeah. And there's
So
such a
telling those
tendency.
people to tap into their creativity might give them a sense of joy momentarily in life, but it's certainly not going to be the kind of creativity that can deal with so momentous an evolutionary situation because it hasn't yet gone through the fires of
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
annihilation and rebirth.
Yeah, I'm so glad you bring up the dark night of the soul, because I was just talking about this last night in my group. You see, like when we're going through, when we're in that caterpillar stage that's liquefied and in this biotic goo, it's really easy to pathologize ourselves and think, oh, I have a big problem, I'm crazy, whatever. And, having encountered the dark, St. John of the Cross's teaching on the dark night, it helped
Been through
me
your own dark
so.
night, Paul. You've
Yeah,
been through
for
a
for
massive
for
dark night,
for
as have
for
I. Yes.
decades, for decades. And one
Yes.
of the things that St. John talks about, it translates in English as the death that's reiterated, the reiterated death. So instead of like, oh, what is today? Today's Thursday. I'll get through my dark night by Monday. No, sometimes it just iterates itself again and again and
Oh,
again over
yes.
decades. But it's all this purification process. Just like if you make gold and you want to make 24 karat gold, you have to put it in the furnace to make it really pure. That's the example of the dark night. And another aspect of the dark night is the person going through it typically feels a million miles away from God. And
This,
but St. John points out that in her absence, that's the presence of God, and we're experiencing it through her absence. And when I think
well,
about
there's
me, I
another
think
way of
about
looking
my.
at it. The darkness itself is the sense's inability to register the immensity of the light that it's being brought towards.
Yeah, yeah, and I
Yeah.
I so relate to this because of my own personal process. Starting in the early 80s, I went through an unbelievable, process of spiritual awakening and then descent into the underworld and dark night of the soul for decades. And I'm still going through a version of that, but yet it was the very thing that connected me with my creative nature, you
Well,
know.
and also it was the very thing that gave you your understanding of the same process going on in the world.
Right.
The
Oh,
people who are
absolutely.
the most authentic evolutionary teachers at this moment are the ones who have gone through the horror of a dark night process, know that the agony and paralysis and despair is very deep on many levels in many aspects of that process, but know also that there is an end to that process, a miraculous and extraordinary end in a
Yeah.
new kind of identity, in a new kind of creativity, in a new kind of
Right.
being.
Right.
But the problem is, and here we are, we know this, you know this from inmost experience, from your learning, from your study, and your work is the most important contribution to understanding this that I know. That's why I love speaking with you. But the problem is that that kind of knowledge that we're talking about now is very subtle and hardly available in our world. Look at the way in which your work and my work has been treated by the spiritual world that has accused us of being obsessed with darkness, doom laden, when in
Right.
fact, what we're trying to bring in is a realistic vision of how darkness works and a realistic understanding born from inmost experience of the nature of the dark night.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
there is a
yeah.
tremendous resistance to the very kind of sobering but ultimately ecstatic knowledge that could actually help us.
And that's just like the imaginal cells, where the goo, the caterpillar goo, feels incredibly resistant to the imaginal cells. And you're totally right. I mean, that's why I point out, like right before the lockdown happened, I finished a chapter on basically that we're all shamans in training. And that's the major archetype that's activated in the collective
Oh,
psyche. And in essence, what that has to do with is, well, when somebody's called to be a shaman, and you would never choose to be a shaman, you'd
exactly.
have to be insane because of the suffering
And
involved.
or a prophet or an evolutionary mystic. You'd have to be crazy to choose
Yeah,
the role
yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
you've
No,
been given
totally.
in the
But
thing.
but when you're being called, the key thing is to assent and to cooperate with the calling,
Yes.
and it invariably involves a descent into the darkness of the unconscious. And this is Jung. He was saying the greatest number one problem of our time right now is that we don't know what's happening. And he says what's happening is we are confronting, we are encountering the darkness of the soul, the darkness of the unconscious. And, and that's why it's so important for people to really to cultivate, to open their eyes and to see in the darkness. And then when you cultivate that awareness, you discover something, and you discover that light is hidden within that darkness. That's what alchemy is about. That's Gnosticism, any mystical tradition. That's what it's about.
Absolutely. Let's go back to this image, though, if we can. I'm sorry to be worrying it, but I'm actually so in awe of what you've come up with that I really
Sure.
want to explore it.
Yeah, yeah.
You've said in this wonderful page that you sent me that we've reached that stage where the beginning of the appearance of the imaginal cells is there, but the dissolution is totally shattering and bewildering
Yeah, yeah,
on a
yeah.
global scale.
Right.
So there are two possibilities, it seems to me. One is that everybody listens to us, gets down with the dark night, realizes that we have a map that is authenticated by the great mystical traditions and the great transpersonal psychological traditions, and that somehow together we find, with encouraging each other, our way through that. That version is highly unlikely in a culture like ours. The imaginal selves are going to be few and far between because the general degradation of the spiritual culture, the psychological culture, political culture is so intense at this moment. So the situation, unfortunately, is likely to get dramatically even worse.
Right.
So, what would you say to people caught in this unprecedented evolutionary turmoil
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
we are facing now and which is
Yeah.
bound to get
Yeah.
worse given the actual sobering facts of our condition?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think there's a quote, Young's, and I think I quoted this in the article. He says, yeah, we are all in the soup together that's being cooked for us. And he goes, the
Yes.
only solution is to go through a symbolic death,
Yes.
And for decades, I've been like, what does he mean, symbolic death? And I've been circumambulating that, and I more and more feel certain. Yeah, it's a death of our false identity. That's Wetiko. That's the mind virus, is identifying with this reference point in space and time, with this limited ego. As soon as I identify with a separate self, then I've created an other. You're an other. As soon as there is an other, there's fear, and fear is the superfood for Wetiko, and it just self-replicates on that,
Yes.
because then it draws all the evidence from the dreamlike nature confirming the truth of its viewpoint. And when you actually go through that symbolic death, and that's exactly the stage of the caterpillar going through the biotic goo, and all of a sudden, if we're those caterpillars, oh my God, everything I believe is true is not true. Who am I? What is the nature of this universe? What is my relationship to it? But when you actually see through that imagination of existing as a separate self, as existing in a way that you do not, then all of a sudden, what do you realize? You realize, oh, wait a second, I'm interconnected with the whole universe, with everyone. We're all interdependent. All of a sudden, you have an expansion of identity. And the energetic expression of that is compassion. And that's why I point out again, and it's not
And
just me,
action.
any
Mm.
wisdom tradition points out that compassion, that's the medicine. That's our nature. And when it's one thing for one person to tap into that, but that's contagious. Just like a butterfly hanging out with caterpillars is contagious to the caterpillars. When somebody is really embodying that creativity, their nature, their love and compassion, same thing like when in past conversations you've shared with me, being with His Holiness Dalai Lama and just being near him, it like opens up your heart, and everybody is just wanting to be in service. That's what I'm talking about. That can go viral. That's contagious, and that's when we connect with other people who are also turning into the spiritual butterflies, who are awakening to our nature. That's a force that's stronger than anything the military industrial complex has.
I'm glad you put it like that because That's a variation of what I try to say to people. I try to say to people, look, the situation is unspeakably terrible. It's going to get worse.
Yeah, yeah.
And the majority of human beings are not going to get with the real deep program of rebirth. They're not, because they don't have the sacred training, they don't have the psychological training, and they don't want it because they are clinging on to a now defunct identity.
Right.
And that's a terrifying situation. But there is one thing that you can be absolutely certain of, and that is that the situation so apocalyptic is designed to create a potentially new humanity, a humanity that is consciously divinized, consciously in touch with
Yeah.
its profound self, and consciously acting with radical compassion on every level to heal and create a new world.
Yeah.
And that's possible. It's not necessarily going to happen, but it's possible. It's in the depth of the DNA of the
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So your one authentic choice is to be one of those imaginal cells, to do
Right.
everything that you can
Yeah. Yeah.
through
Yeah.
spiritual practice, through shadow work, through psychological practice, to become a being that radiates the energy of joy and compassion in the middle of hell.
Yeah. 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 And just if I can
Without
bring in,
agenda, because you don't know if there are going to be enough imaginal cells, whether there will
yeah.
be
Yeah.
a birth. But
Yeah.
that's not your job. Your job
Exactly.
is to
Exactly.
jump into the evolutionary stream and
Yeah.
dive into your new self.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that it's like we are becoming a new species, you know.
Right.
And then I want to bring in quantum physics is, showing us exactly what you were just describing. Because, just in really in essence, there are these quantum entities or elementary particles, which are, the building blocks of this whole physical universe. And there's nothing physical. It's having to do with consciousness. But the point is, these elementary particles exist in a state of potentiality of any and every state they could ever exist in. And then we observe them, and that moment they actualize into one particular manifestation. All the other possibilities just, they just disappear. And each and every moment that process is happening. The point is this: quantum physics is saying, even if one of those possibilities is ridiculously unlikely, it still can happen in this very next moment.
That's
And
it.
so, to use a real life example, the fact that there could be sufficient number of our species who actually awaken, and thereby that affects the whole, collective unconscious, and then, our species begins to awaken, and we avert the myriad catastrophes we're creating. Quantum physics says that is completely and utterly within the realm of the possible. And if you're
Thank you.
not thinking that, then what in the world are you thinking? If you're thinking, oh, we're doomed, then by having that pessimistic attitude, you're going to attract evidence that confirms the truth of your viewpoint, and then you're part of the problem instead of the solution.
Right. What I would put that, and I agree with everything you said, but I put it just in a different vocabulary. I think that seeing the extent and danger and bewilderment and paralysis of our growing death process, to be aligned in your thought and feeling in any way with that death process truly makes it worse. So, the task that's being demanded of us is to, in the middle of all of this madness and chaos, which seems to be globally, unstoppably
Right.
destructive, to align completely with the self, to align completely with the potential birth of the divine human, to align as absolutely as you can, your heart, mind, soul, and body, with the being that you could become, with the butterfly, with the birth of the new human. Because
Yeah.
if you do that, you alter the quantum field. You
Yeah,
send into the
exactly.
core of it
Right.
a massive new energy of intention. Problem with that glorious vision, which I know you share and agree with, is that in our situation, you have to do that majestic and humbling work of total alignment of your whole being with the birth in a situation where you cannot be certain that the birth is going to happen. You have to be
Right.
to claim a
Exactly.
level of responsibility which you have never claimed before, which
Yeah, yeah.
humanity has never been able to claim, a level of responsibility for actually being collaborators, co-creators
Right.
of that birth. That birth isn't automatic. It's not just going to happen because the divine has ordained it, and all you have to do
Sure.
is to do your prayers and be sweet to people. That's not going how it's going to work. You're going to have to die not knowing what that death will birth. You're going to have
Right.
to die not knowing whether there'll be enough people who are born for your dying to mean anything for the future of humanity. You're going to have to risk the most extraordinary, sublime, dangerous, difficult possible adventure, the adventure of transfiguration, the adventure of engoldenment, the adventure of turning up as your radiant divine human, not knowing the way because we don't know the way and not knowing the result. So we're demanding a level of courage, a level of chutzpah, a level of belief in your essential creative human genius that, in fact, humanity has never accessed.
Yeah, yeah. And I love what you're saying. Like it makes me think on a personal level, like when I'm doing meditation and I feel like, oh, these demons or the darkness, oh, I'm being possessed, you know, and that's sort of this microcosmic sort of like reflection of what's happening macrocosmically, like things couldn't seem worse. And yet in the middle of that inner personal individual experience, can I still be connected with the self? Because all of these negative thought forms have hooks that want you to identify with them and want you to absorb in them and take them as being real. And as soon as you do that, then you're screwed. Then you've given yourself away, and then
Mm.
you're in samsara. And this process is happening each and every moment. But the other part of it is that all of those like seemingly dark forces that we can encounter very easily in our mind, they're actually secretly our allies. They're actually helping us to even more remember our already always connection to our true self. And to
And
cultivate
driving
that,
us to
that's what you're
have
that's another
that
way of saying
connection.
what yeah, it's another way of
Sorry,
saying what you're saying.
well, they're driving, not only are they helping us, but they're in their intensity, they're driving us to that connection as the only possible way through.
Right. And that's why I describe Wetiko, the mind virus, as the greatest catalyst to human evolution that we've ever known. Because it seems like it's just evil and, oh, we need to get rid of it or exorcise it or kill it. And no, it's actually the same thing with Buddha. When Buddha was under the Bodhi tree meditating right before he became enlightened, he
Mhm.
was like assaulted by all the darker forces, by the evil one. And I point out in my work that they were secretly helping him. They were helping him to cultivate the muscle of realization. But if you see it through this, this kind of other lens, oh, they're bad, they're negative, they're obstacles,
Well, Heraclitus said, without contraries, no progression.
Right.
And the
And that's
greatest
young
mystics
too,
of
the whole
human,
tension of the
yeah,
opposites.
right. And
Exactly.
Nicholas of Cusa said that God is a coincidence of opposites, a coming
Right.
together of opposites.
Right.
And this is such a divine manifestation because we're being presented with two unimaginable opposites. On the one hand, the possibility of quite rapid extinction on a mega level.
Right.
And on the other hand, the real possibility of a massive transmutation of the human.
Right.
We've never been faced with these
No,
opposites
this is
before,
unlike,
and we
yeah.
have no. In my heartbreak is that in the culture that we are living in, both possibilities are very rarely deeply discussed. On the one hand, the possibility of rapid extinction is derided as doomsaying in the face of overwhelming evidence that it's possible. And on the other hand, if you talk about Aurobindo or theosis or transmutation or engoldenment in the spiritual world, they look at you as if you are crazy crazy because they're ignorant of these themes and of this possibility, and also because they've bought a very narcissistic spirituality, which doesn't demand what the engoldenment process demands, which is massive stamina, massive courage, massive passion, massive commitment in the face of overwhelming apparitions of darkness to hold to the most impossible possible light.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, what you're saying, it speaks to me so deeply. In my neighborhood where I live in Portland, there's one of the biggest metaphysical bookstores in the country, and they won't even carry my book. And they know me. I've
Oh, the
taught there
same
for
with me.
years, and they won't even carry my books on Wetiko because they don't want to let anything in the store that talks about evil. And I try to point out, but they can't hear this, that well, in your avoidance of the darkness, you're unwittingly feeding it, you know. And with your unconscious identification with light, you're avoiding having a relationship with a part of yourself, and of course, the idea is to not become fascinated with the darkness, but the idea is to see it, is to not turn a blind eye. And then when you see it as a sovereign being, we get to choose how we invest our attention. And then we can say, oh, okay, I see you. I see how you operate covertly in the world and in my own unconscious through my reactions and projections. And being a sovereign being, I want to invest my attention, my awareness in creating the world I want to live in. That's kryptonite to the mind virus.
But the reality is, I'm not playing devil's advocate just for fun. I'm
No,
playing
I
it
appreciate the
for
devil's advocate part.
really
Yeah.
important because your message is so important. How do we introduce these rich and deep and large visions into spiritual and literary world, which is so depleted, so addicted to the bottom line, so hungry to feed people pabulum at the very moment when the only thing that could be of any real help is this severe and demanding transpersonal, psychological, and mystical vision? How can
Yeah.
we do this?
Right. And that's a great question. And it brings up for me, too, one of the qualities of the mind virus. When the mind virus is around, it's not safe to speak. Like if you speak the truth, if you speak what your experience is, you'll get censored, you'll get demonetized, deplatformed, all of those things. And, I think that the question that you're asking is such a great question. And I think one of the key things is for us to really shed light on our own darkness inside of ourselves. And to the extent that we've done that and are continually doing that, that enables us to meet the darkness in the world in a skillful way. And the images, yeah, for us, I think of myself, and same with you, Andrew, just to embody being as congruent as we can be, having integrity, standing for what we're experiencing. And yeah, a lot of people don't have eyes to see, but there are more and more people who are opening to that. More and more people are going through their addictions or their traumas or their wounding, and that opens people up to hearing about this
Well,
stuff in a
that
way that
that
they weren't before.
you know, I love the trumpet of optimism in your voice, but I want to again play the devil advocate
Yeah,
and see
no,
where
totally.
it's not, because this is such a serious conversation, and you're the only person I can have it with. When you were going through your terrifying dark night, when you were halfway through and everything was collapsing, there was no way in which you could possibly have imagined an outcome.
Yeah, no, and not only that, I mean, at the beginning, every single person who knew me when I first began having my awakening was telling me, oh, you're mentally ill, you're in denial of your illness, we guarantee this, you'll have to be on pharmaceuticals the rest of your life. And I just thought, oh my God, they're all crazy. But yeah, I've been going through this for over 40 years. It's been a 24/7 thing.
Me too. Yeah.
And I've just had to really trust. And if I could just share with you, because I had this image when you were asking me that, I'm really connected with my unconscious and with my dreams. And the last 1 year, I've had the most two amazing dreams, and they were very similar. And in both dreams, I had this incredible encounter with evil, with archetypal evil. I was surrounded by evil forces. And in the first one, I was completely in terror. I was trembling in terror. And I began one pointedly just doing the mantra of Padmasambhava, who's the supreme exorcist in Tibetan Buddhism. And it went on for like an hour. It went on for like went on for like an hour, and it was like a vision. And then I just woke up, and then, maybe 6 months after that, same dream, encountering complete archetypal evil. And I'm not terrified. I was just very scared. And I began doing Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, the mantra of compassion. So it's very, very interesting, the idea of when you when you encounter the darkness, to be connected with some form of calling on a higher power. That higher power is your nature. That higher power is the self. Om Mani Padme Hum is the mantra of compassion. And so, I was so happy after both dreams that instead of just splitting and dissociating or running away, no, that I was able to cultivate awareness in the middle of being completely terrified, And I think that's a skill, like going to the gym, that you develop from spiritual practice.
And that is the skill that we most deeply need. There is one more thing that I'd love to have your deep wisdom on. You've talked a lot and very eloquently about the depth of shadow work that we need. You've asked us to look at the ways in which we collude with Wetiko. We are unconsciously driven by the impulses that are destroying the planet. What I've noticed in my own shadow work, but also in my dealing with many spiritual clients, is that, how can I put this most clearly? The problem with 95% of shadow work in our culture is that the shadow work is done from a consciousness that is contaminated by the shadow.
Right.
So that means, in practice, that you can't go very deep down into the real horror of the real shadow, because you simply would explode. You don't have this inner strength, and you don't have the calm, and you don't have the discerning wisdom, because your consciousness is the level of the shadow it's dealing with.
Yeah.
And when you read Aurobindo, this is very important, it seems to me, because you can't simply say to people, do shadow work, because what kind of shadow work are you going to ask them to do? And you said there are a lot of people who are going on about their traumas and their agonies and their terrible story and all that. In my experience, that isn't necessarily leading to awakening. It's leading to drowning in the story and making the story your identity, because you're doing that shadow work from the very consciousness that is actually riddled with that shadow.
Yeah. No,
And what can I just make one point? And then I'd love to have your comment on this. Aurobindo addresses this brilliantly. He says the deep limitations of all psychoanalysis, including, he says, Jung, is that the depths of the shadow cannot be gone down to except by someone who is on the fringes of superconsciousness, because only that level of consciousness will create a kind of bathyscape powerful enough to go down into the Philippine trench of the real shadow and not be totally overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, because that's the danger, is to see, the depth of your own darkness and to identify with that and to fall into despair. And, in his work, Jung talks about exactly what you're talking about. He calls it something like, it's like Satan trying to get rid of Satan. It's like the darkness trying to get rid of the darkness. It'll never work. But what he says is very interesting. He says, so often when we as an individual are doing shadow work and just by ourselves, we see our shadow, and that easily can turn into the idea of our shadow instead of a real confrontation with our shadow. Because when it's a real confrontation, it's mortifying. He goes, but here's the thing. And I want to add to that. It's like, say if the two of us are hanging out and I act out my shadow, right? I fall unconscious, I act it out. instead of me just being alone in my apartment and it turning into an idea of my shadow, there's you who sees my shadow, and I see that you see my shadow. That process activates a witness in my own psyche. Now that I'm in a
Yes.
relationship and somebody outside of myself is seeing it, then I can't avoid it, and I can't
And
just
also
feebly.
suffering it too.
Yeah, yeah,
Because I
yeah. I'm
think we
suffering.
only really confront our shadows when we see the amount of pain that they inflict on the people we love and admire the most
Right. And that's
and
one
are
of the
compelled
hardest
to suffer
parts.
it.
That's one of the hardest parts of the shadow. I've seen this with so many clients,
Yeah.
is for them to reflect upon, oh my God, I'm inflicting suffering on people I love via my unconscious shadow, you know. So you're totally right. That would be a great book, by the way. I just want to, suggest to you the idea of, yeah, this idea of shadow, of seeing our shadow, that's been co-opted by like pop psychology in a
It's
way.
turned into marzipan like everything else. The
Right,
real confrontation of the shadow is the most difficult part of the path. It
right.
demands a very high level of consciousness and being aligned with that, because what you're going to see is would otherwise reduce you to ash and screams.
Right. And that's why
And
the
unless
importance
you
of,
also know that you
Mhm.
are divine, your exposure to your human shadow and to the shadow within the divine will send you mad. And there are many asylums filled with people who have
Right.
seen the shadow in its ultimate form without the kind of equipment to stay steady and grounded and able to process just what they're given to see.
Yeah, and that's why the importance of really cultivating, even though it's not the true self, a sense of self, a sense of ego. Because if you haven't developed a sense of self and then you encounter these archetypal, transpersonal, higher dimensional forces, the powers and principalities of the Bible, you'll get completely overwhelmed and it'll be a catastrophe, you know? Yeah.
Problem to get back to the whole wonderful page that you wrote. Problem is that at this moment, at this particular moment, is that we are witnessing a massive global dark victory of the powers and principalities, and we're witnessing it as a humanity which doesn't really accept that powers and principalities exist, hasn't got sacred tools or psychological tools to deal with its own relationship to the shadow or the way in which those power principalities can manipulate us. And that puts additional responsibility on the few of us who are growing, I hope, who really are beginning to,
Yeah,
doesn't it?
yeah. Well, it's funny. I wanna, as we get close to ending, there's in my book that came out a year ago, I have all of these in the back of the book. There were these acronyms, and there's one acronym that is really speaking to people that I want to share, and it's actually pronounced RTSE, RTSE, and RTSE. What it stands for is revelation through suppressing exposure. Right now, just think about that. Here are like say for example, the student protesters who are just amazingly inspiring. They're protesting genocide, right? And then the darker powers are like shutting them down. Well, that's a revelation. They're by doing that, they're showing who they work for. The darker powers are exposing themselves. And so the point is that in the manifestation of the dark, it's actually in service to the light if you have eyes to see.
If you have eyes to see. And that is what you and I are urging people to. And I cannot urge you, my friends, strongly enough to read. Paul's whole oeuvre is astonishing and original. But if you really want to get a hold on what he's saying and helping us to see, please read Wetiko, Healing the Mind Virus That Plagues Our World. This is an essential book for everybody who's adult. And I'd just like to end by reading something on the creative spirit,
Yeah,
because you
yeah,
began with talking about the creative spirit, and you're
right.
so eloquent about it at the end of this totally grueling but amazing book. It is no badge of honor or measure of sanity to adapt to a world gone mad. Instead of trying to adapt to the world's insanity, person who is awakening remains open to the world and open to their wounds, such that a regenerative and curative power arises from within their own dark depths in response. This healing power is the creative spirit. The creative impulse is simultaneously an individual and collective phenomenon, which is to say that when any of us becomes a channel for this spirit, it serves all of us. And then this paragraph. A creative person's healing power lies in their willingness to not cling to fixed ideas of who they are or the world at large, but to allow themselves to be shaped and informed by new experiences of the world. Then, in turn, they are able to translate and craft these experiences into novel articulations. This involves a receptivity to authentically and imaginatively respond to the reciprocal interactions and continual collisions with the inevitable wounding between ourselves and the world. The litmus test for our creativity is our inspired response or lack thereof to these experiences.
Yeah. Wow.
So, what you're asking us to do, I think, is to stay open even in this nightmarish bewilderment and dissolution that we find ourselves, to align ourselves with the deep self through creative endeavors, but also especially through deep spiritual practice, and to align ourselves with the goal, potential goal of this process, the birth of a new kind of human being.
Yeah,
If
yeah. No,
we can
I
do
just,
that,
yeah.
then we can get through this.
Yeah, I just want to say that was so cool for me when you were reading my words, because I was thinking, wow, that's really good. Like who's the author? In the sense that there's no identification. Like, for me, my experience with being creative is that I just get out of the way and then I
Right.
become some sort of instrument and something comes through me that's beyond me. And there's something profoundly healing about that experience. And that's what I'm talking about being creative. And what it does not mean is we have to be a painter or a sculptor or a writer. No, just the way we live our lives, the way we wash dishes or walk or do anything can be creative. That's what quantum physics is really pointing at, that each and every moment we are creating our experience. There's no one else doing that for us. When we add consciousness to that, that's when we're connecting to who we are.
Well, thank you so much. That was really wonderful to be with you. And I hope that
Oh,
everybody will not only enjoy, it's a strange word perhaps, for this conversation, but share it with people,
well.
because I think we've covered a great deal of ground that could be very, very useful.
And if I could just say
Thank you
one
so
thing,
much.
Andrew, I so appreciated at certain points you were playing devil's advocate, and that helps me because that helps to bring out maybe a more like a further articulation of something that it challenges me, and that's great.
Oh, it's essential, isn't it? I love it when that happens to me because danger is we get stuck in our own silos and are continually thinking and elaborating our own thing instead of coming together. You and I are completely aligned in this. It's just that there are questions that have arisen in me which only draw you out more deeply. And it's why
Right.
I think two is better than one against Wetiko, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that's the power of community. I mean, this is
Mhm.
Jung says this, he wrote this letter to Bill W., the guy who started AA.
Yes.
He was saying when you confront evil, because evil is at the bottom of addictions, he says if you just are by yourself, you'll get destroyed. The power of community, when you connect with other people, that then that's like in Buddhism, that's one of the refuges, the three refuge, Buddha, Dharma,
Really.
Sangha, the community.
That's what we've been, in a way, modeling this time because
Right.
we're deepest of friends and aligned
Yeah,
at the
yeah.
deepest level with this vision, but we both have different perspectives which only enrich each other's.
Totally. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Well,
Thank
yeah, I
you
just want to thank you
so
so much,
much.
Andrew, for the invite. Really.
Bless you. I'm so thrilled and I've loved every moment of it.
Totally. Same here.